one that falls for this Sunday. Here we go. So, say what? More people might have come, yeah. So we are in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, and we're in the middle of a section on the Sermon on the Mount that Paul DeMott kind of started and launched, which was the section that talks about fulfilling the law, about righteousness and fulfilling the law. And at the very beginning of this section, Jesus says, unless your righteousness is better than the Pharisees, you don't have a chance at getting into the kingdom of God. And then he goes on to offer his own interpretation of some of the pieces of Mosaic law, especially pieces connected to the Ten Commandments. He starts out, we talked last week, he talks about the commandment where it says, you've heard it said that you should not commit murder, but I tell you, if you get angry with somebody, you've done the same thing. And in fact, if you insult somebody or call them a fool, you've done the same thing. And what Jesus did with that interpretation of that commandment was to essentially bring us all into the guilty community. Right? It's easy for a lot of us to say, I've not killed anybody. That doesn't refer to me. But when you say, being angry with someone, wanting something bad to happen to them because of your anger against them, or insulting them, anytime you have made someone else less than you and given you the right to put yourself above them in judgment, you've essentially done the same thing. So Jesus has said, welcome, y'all. We're all part of this murderous community. And today he does kind of the same thing in a different direction. Today he takes two pieces also from the Ten Commandments, adultery and divorce or covetousness of another person's wife in this case, because women were property at that point in time. And he says, so it's really easy for some of us to be off the hook or believe ourselves off the hook. I spent 50 years of my life being able to look at this text from kind of a holier-than-thou point of view, only to discover myself in my 50s to completely fail on all accounts. So this is a text that speaks to me today in a way that it didn't when I was 20, 30, 40 years old. And I think it speaks to a lot of us who have lived long enough to realize that we're not always faithful to the promises we make, and we're not always faithful to the commitments that we seek to keep. And that there are things that happen, there are choices that we make, there are errors that we engage in that cause us to fail. What then? Does that mean it's all over? That we're out? That there's no hope for us? I don't think so. And that's what I want to talk about today as we look at this passage. When we were at the Youth Triennium this last week, week before last, every day there's a good preacher. Every day there's a great preacher, really. They pull some of the best preachers from our denomination to speak at these events. And David Gambrell, who's in the office of worship for the National Church, was one of those preachers. And David did something, his sermon topic was around the nature of sin. And he did something that stuck with me and that I found to be absolutely brilliant and insightful. And then I discovered when I was looking it up that other people have also shared this, and it's not just his idea, but I want to share it with you. He said, sin in our society has been commercialized quite effectively. He took the 7 deadly sins out of the Old Testament and laid out each of them, and he said, social media has managed to capitalize on every single one of these 7 deadly sins and turn it into a way to make money. He said, let's just go down the list. He says, lust. Well, what would be the app for lust? Maybe Tinder? How about gluttony? Well, what about that Yelp app that we use on a regular to figure out what the best restaurant is with the best price so we can eat the best and highest quantities of good food? Yelp, thank you very much. Or greed. Perhaps LinkedIn, that app that guarantees our connection to all of the professional relationships that are going to enable us to advance our career and make all the money that we want to make. Or sloth. Just go to Netflix. All day long. All day long. Wrath? Well, that's an easy one. Our president knows exactly which one of the apps is good to exercise and spew his wrath on the whole American community. It's Twitter, of course, and we respond in kind. Wrath has an easy vehicle in Twitter. Depersonalized, able to be very, very hurtful without witnessing the consequences of your words in the face of the person who receives them. Envy, perhaps Facebook, where you look at everybody else's happy lives and people experience now depression because they get stuck viewing the happy lives of others and wishing theirs were that way as well. Or pride. Gotta be the Instagram. Look at me. I'm really cool. You can follow me and I'll become your person to follow in the latest fashions and the latest cool things because I have a social presence and a following. Clearly, our society has discovered, and the developers of these apps have discovered a way to take the propensity that we have as human beings for failure and fracture in these various significant and long recognized arenas of our lives and turn them into cash to make a profit for their own pocket. Unless your righteousness is greater than that of the Pharisees, you have no chance of entering the kingdom of heaven, says Jesus. And when he says what he does about adultery, he begins challenging the very core of male identity in his time, for sure. He says, yeah, you want to judge people for committing adultery? Well, have you ever looked with desire on someone who's not yours? And ladies, I really don't think you can be excluded from that. My wife has the hots for Dwayne Johnson, what can I say? I ain't that. But when Jesus expands that error from the limited box of being unfaithful to a spouse and says, it's in your heart. What I really want you to pay attention to is your own heart and your responsibility for the decisions you make out of the desires of that heart. You're responsible for that. You see, in John, we have the famous story of the woman who was caught in the midst of adultery and dragged before all the men of the community who were ready to beat her to a pulp with their stones. And Jesus does exactly the same thing with them that he does with this text today. He says, you think you get to judge somebody on this front? All y'all who ain't committed no sin, pick your stones up and start throwing. Because there ain't none of us, not a one, who has that right. And he sets her free. And he does the same thing with the woman at the well in Samaria who has had 5 different men and is now living with somebody that's not her husband. And she becomes the first witness in Samaria without Jesus saying word one about her marriage or lack thereof. What Jesus extends to us is an invitation to see ourselves among the broken and not among the righteous. Because your righteousness must be even greater than the Pharisees if you got a prayer at getting into the kingdom by your own righteousness. And then he uses hyperbole to make his point even stronger. He's like, if your eye is causing you to sin, then gouge out your eye and throw it away. Better to go to heaven without an eye than to go to hell with it. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Better to go to heaven without your hand than to go to hell with it. Now, do you think that's what he meant for us to do? Of course not. He wasn't looking for a community of handless, blind disciples. He needed their eyes. He needed their hands. He needed their hearts. That was the most important piece. So he uses the hyperbole to say, of course, this is not the answer. You can't gouge out your eye. You can't gouge out your brain. You can't gouge out the pieces of you that think you in wrong directions or that walk you down a trail that you shouldn't have traveled. What God wants us to know is that we all fall in this category of the broken. By the time he gets through this whole section, there's got to be nobody in the crowd who's feeling themselves very superior over anybody else. Because the only way any of us have any hope of heaven, any hope of salvation, is because of God's faithfulness and commitment, which is never broken. Because we break ours. We fail. We stumble, we fall. We don't fulfill our word all the time. He moves on to divorce. And it's interesting. This is a little trickier for us. The church has struggled around a variety of issues related to marriage over the years. And the Protestant Reformation, the church struggled with, well, can a pastor be married? Because, up until that time, for centuries, the tradition was no. You can't be a pastor and be married. And to be married is to be in violation of the church's, at that time, understanding of the role of clergy and the role of marriage. Well, that's clearly changed. It changed a long time ago. And then a little bit later, there was a challenge and a question about what was the role of the church in validating and establishing marriages versus the role of the state in validating and establishing marriages. And there was a battle over who had the higher authority in that regard. And there's still some question about that, because a marriage that I do on behalf of the state. I am essentially an agent of the state when I do a marriage. So there's kind of an interesting melding there that happens. Then the church wrestled with issues related to divorce during my lifetime, especially divorce for pastors. So much so that even though I felt like that was resolved, when I got divorced, there were a number of folks in this church who couldn't tolerate a divorced pastor and have left. So that still lingers around with us today. And there's the matter of marriage between folks of the same gender, which, again, our church's discernment is that love is love. And that when love wants to be committed, it is right for us to bless that commitment. But not everybody sees it that way, and some have left because of that. So there are places where we don't see eye to eye and where we are still unpacking and unfolding things. But what I want to tell you out of that little brief history of some of the questions around marriage that the church has dealt with is that the church's attitude about marriage has not been exactly the same for the last 2,000 years. It has been developing, unfolding, emerging. And what we see in Jesus' words around divorce, in the text we have before us today, and then later in chapter 19, where he talks about it, is that Jesus is expanding the understanding that most people had at that time. And he does it in three important ways. One, he clearly, in direct opposition to what the Old Testament portrays, says you should have one wife and one husband, not more than that, at a time, for sure. Polygamy is, in Jesus' eyes, something that needs to change. Jesus also takes a step toward leveling the double standard between men and women by holding the men accountable for adultery as well as women, which is a step in the right direction. Before, women were the seductresses. They were clearly the ones responsible. If a man fell into adultery, it was because he was not responsible. She clearly enticed him. It's all her fault. Ladies, how do you like that? Yeah, I mean, clearly not accurate, right? We can see that now. Wasn't quite so obvious back then because people were steeped in a tradition that believed differently. And Jesus also lifts up a little more protection for the women who were subject to being divorced at a whim, without any reason whatsoever, and without any recourse. Because when you were cut off from a husband, you had no voice in the public arena at all. You can't defend yourself as a woman in that day. And so Jesus was saying, you know, if a woman is divorced, at least give her the opportunity to be able to be a whole person again. Don't just make divorce so easy that somebody can dispense with her and throw her to the curb where she has no visible means of support whatsoever. So for me, I see Jesus opening the way for us to see this differently. And as the church has reflected on and sought to engage matters around marriage and its fractures and failures, the church has sought to extend greater and greater mercy, greater and greater forgiveness, and less judgment. And I believe that to be true to the direction of Jesus' teaching. So as I look at these two texts, which I got to tell you, I was sweating the preparation of this sermon because I know this is really not comfortable stuff for us to deal with. It's very uncomfortable for me as well. But what I find as I dig deep within this text and the body of the text that we're looking at in the Sermon on the Mount, what Jesus is doing is building a case that shows every single one of us to fall short. Every single one of us to be failures. Every single one of us to be inadequate in our fulfillment of the law. Because when we recognize that, and only when we recognize that, can we cast ourselves upon the mercy and the grace of God, which is the only truly faithful and committed thing that is worth casting yourself upon. It is that grace, it is that mercy, it is that forgiveness that we name every time we pour water in this font and we say, this is the font of new beginnings where we are washed and cleansed of our sin and given a chance to try again. That is the word I want you to hear today. Because I believe with all my soul that is what Jesus is driving at. You may feel this big. You may feel completely filthy for the things that you have done. You may feel completely outside the realm of grace. But the Word that Jesus speaks to us is no. All of us land outside that circle of legal righteousness. But the great and good news is that God reaches right into that circle and pulls us out from that circle and pulls us in and says, you are holy and righteous because I have made you so, because I have declared you so, because I claim you as such, not because of what you have done, but because what I have done and who I am. Because in Jesus Christ, no matter what you've done, you are forgiven. Thanks be to God.
Amen.
Amen. Lord, please give us that grace today. Those of us who feel oppressed by our failures, those of us who feel beaten down by our guilt, please give us the grace to hear the liberating words of your mercy and your love. That it is only by your gracious mercy which rains down upon the just and the unjust alike that we have any hope of being free, of being saved, of being yours. And reach into our hearts one more time this day and pull us back into the circle of mercy and of grace. And let us be thankful that that is who you are. Through Christ our Lord we pray. Amen. Friends, we live in a really tough time. And living in this neighborhood